Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today for this meeting of the Oakland Economic Recovery Advisory Council. I'm Alexa Jeffress, the Director of Economic and Workforce Development. We have a full agenda today, so we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to hear from some of our speakers. We've had a lot of great input from you since our last meeting, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you. I wanted to just walk us through our agenda for today. So first, I'm going to spend a few minutes just walking you through some of the reopening updates for those of us that have been tracking the reopening changes at the state and the county level. It has been a really head-spinning few days and weeks. So we have some slides prepared, and I'll walk you through trying to add some clarity and keep up with all the changes that are happening around the county and the state around reopening. Next, Marissa Raya, our project lead from the city for economic development, is going to share some updates from the city about what the city has been doing in response to this council's recommendations and what the ongoing work is. Then Jose Corona is going to lead us through a update and report out from our working groups and our working group leads, and then facilitate a discussion around the ideas and the recommendations that we've heard so far. Then next, Michael McAfee from PolicyLink, who we're very honored and pleased to have as our new co-chair, stepping in for James Head when he became unavailable, is going to be centering our discussion around what it really means to have a people-centered, equitable recovery, and sharing the great work that his group at PolicyLink is doing and the thinking that's informing this council. And then finally, we'll wrap up, Marissa will wrap us up and talk about what the next steps are going to be and really what the process is on the city side to condense and synthesize all of these great recommendations and input that we're receiving from this council and how that's going to get translated into next steps in policy. So I wanted to start just by sharing with all of you a slide that you've probably all seen, which is looking at the reopening timeline for Alameda County. So Alameda County, much like the state and mirroring what's happening at the state level, has grouped the reopening process into different categories of businesses that can reopen. And as I'm going through this, please feel free, if you have questions, put them in the chat. If you haven't already, please also introduce yourself, put your name and organization into the chat. And if there are any questions that we don't get to answering during this discussion, we'll stop at the end to take additional questions, or you can email them to us offline, or we'll follow up afterwards from the chat. But on the Alameda County reopening timeline, so as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's been very confusing and there's been a lot of changes happening at the county level and at the state level. So the Alameda County reopening was tracking according to this timeline, which was moving through a process starting in March going into May, when they started to allow some outdoor activities, construction, and then some essential businesses. Curbside retail happened in May. And then that was expanding more to outdoor dining, which came out in last month. Alameda County issued an order, which was actually the last official order that Alameda County issued, allowing outdoor dining and some other activities like outdoor museums, religious and cultural ceremonies, and outdoor fitness and summer schools. So that was the trend that appeared to be happening the last time this Recovery Council met. And I think we were all preparing and planning for a continuous reopening process that kept moving through this continuum with the next phase that was anticipated to include things like personal services, salons, barbershops, and indoor dining, as we had seen in other counties. However, unfortunately, events had happened since the last time this Recovery Council met, and particularly changes that we've seen in COVID-19 cases and hospitalization rates over the last few weeks and days have really thrown a wrench into this reopening process and really changed how the reopening process was progressing. I think, as everybody knows from tracking the news, Alameda County has seen a spike or an increase in new COVID-19 cases, as has the entire state of California and the entire country. And so because of this spike in cases and the increase in hospitalization rates, Alameda County made an announcement recently that they were going to pause reopening. So what does it mean to pause reopening? The statement from the county that at the time when this came out was that they would be extending the timeline for the next phase of reopening. At the time, towards the end of June, they had intended to submit what's called a variance attestation, which is basically a certification that the county makes to the state of California to certify that they are complying with reopening requirements and that they are meeting certain guidelines and numbers in order to qualify to reopen according to a different schedule and to exercise more discretion at the county level about how they reopened goods and services and businesses. So initially the plan prior to the pause was for that variance attestation to be submitted by the county, first to the Board of Supervisors and then to the state for approval on June 30th. We learned last week that the county was actually planning to bring that variance attestation to the Board of Supervisors on July 14th, which is tomorrow. So why does this matter? It matters for a few reasons. While Alameda County had previously allowed outdoor dining under its county order, because Alameda County wasn't a variance county, they didn't have the ability to businesses couldn't apply to the state alcohol and beverage control in order to receive temporary catering permits to serve alcohol outdoors. So the hope and the expectation was that when this variance attestation was submitted, that among other things, restaurants and businesses in Alameda County could take advantage of things like applying to the state alcohol and beverage control. But as we've learned, several things have happened even since then. So on Friday night, Alameda County issued an announcement, a press release, stating that under new stricter state guidelines, which was a county interpretation of those state guidelines, that outdoor dining was actually not allowed in counties that hadn't submitted their variance attestation, which included Alameda County. So I think as many of the people on this call and as we at the city were involved, it was a very confusing and chaotic time over the weekend trying to resolve this conflicting guidance and understand and communicate to restaurants and businesses that had previously understood that they were allowed to participate in outdoor dining, that was now potentially being rolled back under this new stricter interpretation of the state guidance. And then additionally, on Sunday, after that happens Friday night, on Sunday afternoon, the state announced that Alameda County had actually been added to what's called the monitoring list. And so we'll talk about that some more on the next slide, but that essentially means that Alameda County, like other counties that are seeing spikes in COVID-19 cases, is subject to different level of state oversight. And then today, in fact, just a few hours ago in the governor's announcement, California announced that it was pausing its reopening. And this means that all counties have to close indoor operations. So even counties that were allowed to allow dine-in restaurants, for example, now have to pause and roll that back. And as a corollary to that state sort of pause on reopening, the California also announced that the county attestation process, so this variance process, has been paused and no further variance attestations would be accepted. So we're still working closely with the county. We have city staff talking to the county daily, trying to understand how things are progressing and how to best communicate and share this with businesses. As of now, the variance hearing attestation is still scheduled to go in front of the Board of Supervisors tomorrow, and we'll just need to be closely contacting with the county to understand what that means in terms of potentially rolling back and allowing outdoor dining and potentially liquor license applications to state ABC. Another thing is the Alameda County face mask requirement. Since the last time we've met, there have been a lot of heightened announcements and requirements around using face masks. So the city has been working to advertise and support that as well. We talked about the permit for alcohol services. So alcohol licensing is handled by the state alcohol and beverage control. As I discussed, one of the reasons that the city was working closely with the county and hoping to move forward on this variance attestation was to get some clarity and progress for restaurants around being able to apply for a temporary catering permit to serve alcohol outdoors, because we know that's such an essential part of restaurants' viability to be able to have the increased sales from alcohol if they're allowed to serve food outdoors. So hopefully that we'll get some clarity and resolution on that as the county moves forward with its variance hearing tomorrow. And then finally, as I mentioned, The state has a monitoring list, which essentially is a list of certain counties that are added to a list if they have increasing COVID-19 cases. Alameda County was not on that monitoring list until yesterday, Sunday the 12th. So as of July 12th, they were added to that monitoring list. What that means is that we're subject to a higher level of oversight from the state monitoring strike teams. So I'm going to pause there, and I know that's confusing. I know it's a lot of information. Like I said, we've been trying on the city side to keep up with it and to communicate as clearly as we can to businesses. But I'll pause for just a second and see if anybody has any questions about all of that. You can either put your hand up or just take yourself off mute.
I have a question. So, you know, obviously, you know, I speak for the small restaurant community, and you know, as you can imagine, this was a very difficult weekend, as you know, the state, the county, and the city tends to keep putting obstacles in our way instead of removing obstacles and making it easier for small businesses to continue to exist in this pandemic. That aside, you know, at this point, what's the timeline for the variance is my first question. And the second question is, I have patios that are you know, I could serve alcohol on my patios. I am confused whether that's still acceptable or not.
Yeah. So thanks, Chris. So on the timing question, as I said, as of our last discussion with the county, they said they were still planning and they're scheduling to bring their variance attestation to the Board of Supervisors tomorrow. The unknown in that is that since this new information from the state today saying that with the rollback on reopening, that they aren't accepting any new variance attestations at the state level, it remains to be seen. So we just don't know yet if that will be considered or when it will be considered. Before this new information from the state came out today, the word from the county was that the variance applications were being approved at the state level within a day or two to up to a week. So we were cautiously optimistic that this was all going to be resolved this week or next week at the latest. But again, with the changes in coming from the state about putting the variance applications on hold, I think we just have to wait until we have more information, and we'll share it as we get it. The question of, yeah.
So it sounds like that's not a safety issue. That's an issue surrounding the county not actually applying for the variance on June 30th. Is that what I'm understanding? Is that they actually didn't file the paperwork when they were supposed to? So this has really zero to do with safety and just more to do with, you know, lack of support for small businesses?
I mean, I can't speak for the county's rationale. My understanding and what they communicated to us was that they pulled back their variance application because it was at the same time that they put a pause on reopening. And then the reason they did that was because of the increase in COVID-19 cases. And then the second question, yeah.
When did they put a pause on stuff? Because the 30th, they could have put the application in, but they never did. And there was no pause on the 30th. So that's not reconciling in my mind. I don't want to deliberate the whole thing, but I just sounds very bizarre.
I know it's frustrating, and I mean, unfortunately, we've been very frustrated by the process too. So.
I think this is Lynette McElhaney. Alexa, just to lift up some of what Chris is saying. Yeah. I'm curious as to whether or not the city is sending anything official to the county with respect to asking for the clarification, so that it's not just the small businesses by themselves, but that we are actually asking, you know, lifting up and elevating our concern around the need for clarity, and saying that we really want the county to be responsive to us as the city with respect to driving these questions. You know what I mean? Like, I think it might be helpful for us to lend our letterhead.
Okay, yeah. Like I said, we have been in constant communication with the county, but unfortunately the information has just been changing so quickly.
I think at some point there's going to need to be, like, I know y'all don't like politics, but it's our system and we are good people, I promise you, that we, you know, there may need to be a different kind of political weigh-in from the supervisors and from city officials. So I just have a couple of questions with respect to what, if anything, are we doing from this table with respect to our museums, our outdoor venues, the zoo, you know, Chabot, Fairyland, and their ability to recover and move forward.
In terms of support for those bodies.
Yeah.
So I know
are they yet scoped within the purview of this task force?
So that's actually a really good question, and I know that the zoo has been suffering a lot under this. So I think broadening the scope of this to discuss that, I think it is definitely something we should consider because of the way that those organizations, because of the way those assets are funded through the Measure C funding. Oh, hi, Councilmember McElhaney.
It's casual Monday.
I understand. It's been a long weekend. So I think because of the way those were funded through the Measure C funding, that they were being addressed, I think, through different channels. But I think we can certainly discuss.
So Fairyland is not. So
Yeah.
Fairyland is the one cultural institution that's not Measure C funded. And, you know, we've got 70 or so employees over there and a venue for young people. So we're running day camp, but they're not yet reopened. And I know that they're doing some advocacy around wanting to be classified at the same strata with the zoo, but it is a real neighborhood impact in District 3.
Yeah.
And so I just want to make sure I was bringing it to your attention. Secondly, what are we doing, if anything, with respect to barbershops and beauty salons?
Yeah, so under the new, I was just reading it before this, under the new state guidance, they're saying that indoor activities, including barbershops and beauty salons, are being basically rolled back or put on hold at the state level. We had never gotten to the stage of permitting them in Alameda County. So unfortunately, yeah, it seems like now that it's been rolled back at the state level, we'll have to see what guidance comes down from the state in terms of allowing that sector to reopen.
Okay, so you guys know me as a little agitator. We'll just be a little agitator again today. One, because we are like in July talking about like rapid response, and we've had like no response, so we don't understand the word rapid. And we clearly need to get a little more urgent and go, like by next week, I want to see how we cut checks to our businesses that are hurting and are really drowning. Like seriously, I'm ready to just be up 22 hours. We got to figure this out, and we've got to get support and relief to our community. The second thing is I think that we lost the narrative when the county stopped using time-determined extensions for the shelter in place. And when we went to an indefinite, we really lost compliance. I mean, at one point I felt like we were like 95% compliant in the city. And I don't know, it feels like it's 3% compliant at now. And I think it's a really hard thing for us to say that we're going to control the spread by not giving safety guidelines for businesses to reopen versus all of the unpermitted activity that is happening in District 3, from barbershops, beauty salons, nail salons, and then the festivals, right? Like the largest Juneteenth I've ever seen in the city of Oakland happened in 2020 in COVID. And it was amazing and insane. 15 to 20,000 people on East Lake with no permits and no guidance, because we've gotten to a place now where I don't think we're gonna do something. So I don't know how the other businesses, but I'm interested in hearing people, some feedback around that, because I think for me, I'm ready to write a letter to the governor and say, and to the state health officer, that this notion of keeping us closed is not keeping us safe. That's how it feels to me, because people have to eat and they're gonna find ways to eat. And that is in itself, without guidance, without protocols and oversight that people can comply with, is how we're getting to a level of spread, which is high contraction rates among our Latino population, high mortality rates among our African Americans, and growing concerns around our Asian and refugee population, where language is a barrier and access to information and education is really minimal. So that's my 2 cents of agitation today, but I'm really interested to hear from other people about this notion of compliance, not compliance, and where we are with the states. What it feels like right now is like a really disconnected closure that's not tied to we're all in it for a limited time to bend the curve. Everybody's been sacrificing, the curve didn't bend, and so now people are trying to figure out how they survive.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think that's actually a good segue to leading into talking about some of the work that the working groups have identified, because I think these questions around compliance and safety are definitely at the top of the list. So I want to make sure we get through the agenda. So I'm going to hand it over to Marissa to talk about the city's updates.
Alex, you were going to answer Chris's other part of his question though, and you didn't get to it, which is, this is Leah with OS Day.
Oh, hi, Leah.
I have the same question. We have a permit, you know, we already serve alcohol on our roof.
Yeah.
And so same as Chris and his patio, you were about to answer that.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry about that.
Just before we move on, I would love the answer.
Yeah, so again, I want to make it clear that I don't speak for alcohol and beverage control because that's regulated by the state. But my understanding is that if a business already has a permit to serve alcohol outdoors, that permit hadn't changed under the previous sort of set of circumstances we were working with until Friday of last week. The temporary catering permit was needed from alcohol and beverage control for a new permit to serve alcohol outdoors. So for example, if you'd set up a new sidewalk cafe. But if you already had a permitted patio space that you'd been using previously, my understanding was that you were allowed to keep using that. Now, given the change since Friday, where the county is now saying that the interpretation of the state restrictions is that non-variance counties like Alameda are not allowed to have outdoor dining at all. I think we need clarity in that area, and we're actively seeking clarity, but I wouldn't want to give you information right now that was incorrect.
So you're actively seeking that. Just let me clarify. Does that mean that you'll let us know? Because that's something that can be clarified fairly easily. Some of this other stuff can't be, but this is a pretty simple question. People like Chris and I to just understand sooner than the rest of the questions. Because I agree with Lynette. There's a lot going on around, you know, if we have to shut down again, I'm all for, you know, getting this under control, and I'm willing to shut my business down. That's not the problem. Yeah. I feel like when you just look at the lake and there's vendors out on the lake and it's just, there's no enforcement. So but yet our business, it has to comply, which we will. And I want this, you know, situation to change, but and I understand that people need to figure out how to put food on the table, but there's no enforcement of, like, in general, if this is about dealing with the rise in cases, or, you know, now the variance process has been delayed, you know, it's just, I need to understand like what they're doing to really deal with what's going on, and also help the people that, you know, we feed through our restaurant, you know, we do meals for the community as well as open, but we need both to survive. We can't just survive on, you know.
I mean, I think it's safe to say if under the current county's interpretation of the state restriction, outdoor dining is prohibited, then the outdoor dining would be prohibited and it would be subject to being inspected. But yes, I agree with you. We can ask the explicit question and get you a response and share it back. So thank you. Okay. I'm going to hand it over to Marissa to talk about city updates. And we'll hold some space for more questions at the end. So thank you, everybody. Again, I know this is beyond frustrating. So thank you for letting us share the information we have.
It's really like we have to start every advisory council meeting with the collective sharing of grievances and how we can sort through them. Thank you, Alexa, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm gonna speed up my part and talk faster than I'd like to try to keep us back on track with the agenda. But I did want to share some funding updates. So some of the first Federal CARES Act had funding for large cities with population of 500,000 or more that they were able to then turn around and offer in loan funds and other resources for businesses. Oakland didn't receive that, but we are going to, we learned I think in June or maybe late May that we will be receiving $40 million in CARES Act funding through the state of California. A lot of that is going to housing and other city services, but 7.7 million is for small business relief, nonprofit relief, and an additional 1.8 million for artists. So it's our top priority as staff right now to get that funding both in the city. It's been programmed into the city budget, and we'll be working to get that out as quickly as possible. And as you heard, we have additional direction from our council members to treat that with the utmost urgency. The next round of funding that we'll be going after is also federal funding through the stimulus. It's through the U.S. Economic Development Administration. We have already secured, applied for and will receive about $500,000 for a revolving loan fund at a very low interest rate for Oakland businesses. But we are going after a second EDA grant fund, which is substantially larger. We'll be submitting our application later this week. That one is competitive, so we'll let you know more about that, and cross our fingers that we'll be receiving that additional funding. We learned just a couple of hours after our last advisory council meeting, staff learned that we had received $28 million over the next 5 years from the State of California Strategic Growth Council Transforming Climate Communities Fund. That money is allocated already in program to a series of community identified and led projects in Deep East Oakland. There is a slice of it for small business anti-displacement work and organizing work led by Advisory Council partner, the Black Cultural Zone and CJ. There's also money for affordable housing, scraper bike share, expansion of the Planting Justice Nursery, and the restoration of the San Leandro Creek. So we're really excited about this project. The city got a perfect score and worked really hard on that one for a couple of years. And then finally, we have a relationship with the Rockefeller Foundation through our Opportunity Zone work, which also leads with equity and is leads with investing in businesses and organizations led by people of color. So Oakland was selected as one of 10 cities through the Rockefeller Opportunity Collective to receive $1 million for economic opportunity for people of color. And there's just a timeline at the bottom of the slide showing when we expect that money to be coming in and starting to go out. We don't get all the CARES Act funding right away, but we do have to spend it all by October 31st, or the state will try to claw some back, and we will not allow them to do that. Next slide, please. Our next update is just about health and safety measures. We really appreciate that this advisory council prioritized right away getting PPE to all Oakland businesses and uniform social distancing and sanitation practices. We've been reaching out to coordinate with our health disparities task force. It's the other city task force underway that's looking at reducing racial disparities in coronavirus infection rates. We heard from the Unity Council issues around lack of enforcement in businesses, and we reached out to the county. They are piloting a community hub project with a testing site in Fruitvale and outreach through partners including La Clinica and Street Level Health and other partners. We also have our posters from the Advisory Council work group that led that to distribute, and we've started distributing PPE kits as well. We're using philanthropic funding for the kits and leveraging the public resources in terms of our distribution networks. And we would like to expand that and do more and make more PPE available to all businesses across the city. We're also learning through conversation with the county where the city can step up and help them get the word out a little bit faster. For example, the city is much faster at translation. We're better at communicating with businesses. So we've been trying to help the county expand its outreach and its communications more effectively. Next slide, please. Updates, as you heard, because of the stop on outdoor dining, we also have to pause our Flex Streets program. So that's applications for that are also temporarily paused. We did create, I wanted to recognize the opening and the celebration for not the Black Cultural Zone, the vision for the neighborhood, but a specific piece of land for the Black Cultural Zone for regular events and food distribution, led by CJ. That was a conversation that started with the city before COVID. That's a lease of public land, and we are expanding Flex Streets and have put a form online for other organizations that want to actually lease city land that's unused for expansion of their business activities. So you can submit a form online, you can see a map of all the city-owned properties, and we have added that to the Flex Streets because what we heard from the council, advisory council, and the community was that not every neighborhood had adequate street and parking space, and sometimes it made more sense to use a piece of city-owned land. Next slide, please. So finally, I wanted to just let you know that one of the ways in which we are using the input that we've heard from the first 3 meetings is in putting together an equitable recovery framework that we are then working into our proposals and conversations with the philanthropic partners and other partners interested in investing in Oakland. So the data at the top of the slide is national data about the number of Black-owned businesses and Latinx-owned businesses, immigrant and women-owned businesses that have likely already closed, permanently closed due to the coronavirus and the shelter-in-place orders. We did our own recovery survey in the city of Oakland. We had almost 300 respondents, and from that, we learned that probably about a third of the Black-owned businesses that applied for PPP, for example, did not receive it. A little more than half of the Latinx-owned businesses, a third of Asian-owned businesses, only 1 in 7 white-owned businesses in Oakland that applied for PPP didn't receive it. So we know that even though we did this additional outreach, and many of you partnered with us on phone banking outreach to businesses and application support, that there is a racial disparity in who has received stimulus funds in the city. We'll be wanting to address that in our recovery planning. And so we've heard a few different things from the council that we're putting forward as priority for funding. The first is immediate relief and cash assistance, direct funding to workers. And the city of Oakland actually was part of a cohort of cities that led a movement at the US National Conference of Mayors. A unanimous vote was taken to support a guaranteed income program, national guaranteed income program. We also are going to be piloting guaranteed income in partnership with Alameda County in Oakland. We are exploring how we can increase digital inclusion for the business and worker community. So we have built on some of the funding success in supporting students who we recently learned will be social distancing when they go back to school, or distance learning when they go back to school. We are also looking into how we can support more businesses to develop digitally and get them the resources they need to reopen while stuck at home. And finally, what's our sort of long-term thinking about supporting entrepreneurs and access to capital and credit and investing both private funds and public funds to build capacity in Oakland for the long term. There are other things that have come out of the advisory council, which I think have been really exciting ideas. For example, we heard from Linda Grant about the cannabis equity permit, applying that equity framing to other industries in Oakland with technical assistance and real estate incubation. So those are things that we're continuing to look at as we develop the recommendations coming out of the advisory council. Thank you. And I'd like to go, can I go straight to, if there aren't any urgent questions, and you're of course also welcome to email me to talk more in depth about any of these. I'd like to introduce Jose Corona and hear from our working groups.
Marissa, can you go back to that prior slide real quick?
Sure.
And is it your sense, do we have a sense yet what the permanently closed data looks like for Oakland?
I don't. This is just a national estimate from National Bureau of Economic Research. I feel like in Oakland, when I look at the number of people that got funds, I think we're doing a little bit better on the racial disparity than some of the national estimates I've seen, which have been closer to 10%, where we have 2/3 success rate. But I don't have a good handle on the closures, and I think it's because we still don't know the real, what's a permanent closure and what's a temporary closure.
Okay, thank you.
There is a University of Chicago study coming out on the disparate impact of PPP lending between the community banks and the big banks.
Thanks,
Thank
Kat.
you. Can we go to Jose?
Yep.
Chris?
Any other questions before I start? And thanks, that was Kat Taylor with Beneficial State Bank on the phone. So thanks, Kat, for chiming in. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks, Alex and Marissa, again for the updates from the city. Yeah, I mean, a lot of work to get done still, and I think we're all trying to do our best. And I appreciate everyone's both support and patience and understanding, and also the critique. You know, it means a lot hearing from you, who ultimately are the ones feeling the pain, the business owners. So thank you for the call outs around the confusion, then more work needs to be done. And that reminds me that we just need to be a lot more closer in communication and lockstep with Alameda County, so they hear directly as well from the people on the ground on the front lines around what's going on. So again, thanks to all the business owners that chimed in. I know Leah and Chris led that effort, so thank you. For the working group updates, we wanted to do it pretty concisely. Today we're going to start from the last group, because I know we've heard from in the past that we kind of sped through the first three and then shortchanged the people, the phase 4 group. So we're going to start with phase 4. And if we can, as you prepare, please present in about 3 minutes. We've allocated about 3 minutes and then leave a little bit just for questions and answers, but we're going to jump right to it. So for phase 4, Dr. Hitano, I don't know if you have a presentation. It seems like you do. So I'll take it away.
Arts sector, the concerts, sports, and generally arts and culture. So our task force, we've been concentrating at this point on a 3-step task for phase 4 businesses. First and foremost is survival and reopening capital. We have a real urgency for fundraising and funding in general for many of the new requirements that we are foreseeing. Of course, we don't even really know what those requirements are going to be. So that's one of the main places that we need to be looking at. We need to create sector proposals to reopen safely sooner, including phase 4 businesses and potentially hotels, as they have meeting spaces for conventions and things like that that are currently not addressed within the hotel openings. And then we need to demonstrate how to physically operate without virus transmission, which means essentially enforcement. So the capital needs model, Trevor Parham over at Oakstop, he's been doing fundraising, and they've also created a financial equation for understanding what most of the businesses needed in order to rebuild and restore their business fronts and things like that. They've also been very successful with crowdfunding opportunities, and really what can we do to partner with each other in the private sector as well as the city, as well as with the individuals within our communities. And then we need to determine a vehicle to receive and deploy funds quickly. For actions, we're going to be inviting the county health representative to our next phase 4 working group to answer questions on guidelines and safety measures, workers' comp insurance, retention and affordability. Of course, as we're going forward, we really have to be aware that with California requiring workers' comp to be paid out fully, that's become an issue for many different businesses as their insurance companies are dropping them or increasing the amount that they have to pay. And then we want to collect 3 case studies for cultural organizations so that we understand the modified reopening costs, what it would cost to hire artists and support staff in re-upping into this next phase. And then of course, safety enforcement staff, compliance officers. So that's sort of the overview of what we're looking at. We want to focus on action. We want to do plans, and we want to be able to help our sectors be able to have a broad opportunity to create these plans together so that we can have an equitable process as well, because we're understanding this is taking immense resources to be able to even put this data together for each organization. And of course, the zoo is a really immediate example of a cultural organization that could very well be lost forever in Oakland, which would be a huge blow to equity, just in that loss itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. Are there any questions from the group, from the council for this working group?
Thank you for the presentation, Doctor. I'm just curious, in one of the slides you talk about the fundraising, and are you finding that because of the crisis you're able to raise the same amount of funds from philanthropy and individual donors? Is it giving you some way to raise more right now, or are we seeing a significant decrease in the amount of monies that you all are raising?
Well, that's a couple of answers to that. We are still seeing that there is a desire for people to give. It's important to everyone. I think that the businesses in our communities, I've heard so many different people saying, well, I'm still sending money to my hairstylist every 4 weeks like I normally would, because I really want them to be there when I come back. So I think that there is opportunity there. But I think that we need to have a concerted effort to understand what is that dollar amount that each business needs for different types of needs. So first is survival. How do we keep all the animals in Oakland? That's a sort of a first thing. But then what is the true cost to reopen, given the guidelines that we're going to have? And we're going to have to be able to reopen. Otherwise, these businesses, they will not survive. I think that there are opportunities. We just need to be very creative about it, and understanding that as long as we can figure out a way to enforce these issues, that's the biggest hurdle for us right now. And I believe it's going to cost quite a bit of money, because we're going to need compliance officers. The zoo, it's outdoors, it could be treated like a museum, but children running around, you're going to need a lot more staff to be able to watch over the attendees of the zoo, and of course cleaning staff and things like that. And so it seems like just a monumental hurdle to overcome, but we have to somehow be creative. And so I think even with crowdsourcing, perhaps some of these questions could be put out to the public for proposals. Given these things, who in this community has some time? I'm sure there are quite a few people, but really we need to get down to what that dollar number is, so that we can propose that to the city, so that we can propose that to the state, or we can put it as fundraising opportunity to say it takes, for example, $5,000 to help a Black business recover from the damages that they suffered. We need a number to be able to say that we need in order to go out and ask for it.
Okay, thank you.
We want to move on to the next one, but one comment as taking my facilitator hat off, I did want to mention that there are many funds out there that are raising money, and some of them very successfully. But I do want to call out to Councilmember McElhaney's earlier point that that money needs to be going out. I think a lot of people are raising the money, they're sitting in the funds, and I think for whatever reason, the urgency of getting that money out is not seen or is not felt. So I think it's something that I've been following for months now, that so many people are raising money, but the money is just not getting out. And I think it's just the urgency needs to be heightened right now. So that's just my point. Back to facilitator hat. Phase 1 and phase 2, Ari, Barb, Ali, who's going to present?
I have slides. Okay, there we go. And yeah, Barb and Ali, if you have other things to, feel free to chime in too. So our working groups ended up combining because we have a lot of the same concerns for both phase 1 and phase 2. But the main priorities still remain the same. Number one, a safe and successful reopening, getting PPP out to people. And then also in terms of communication, we want to make sure that we have safe and standardized protocols, and enforcement is a big concern. And then the second priority is how do we use public spaces creatively to help small businesses recover. So just in terms of progress and updates, during our last call, we actually did get to speak to the Director of Public Affairs from Alameda County Health, and that was actually really useful for us to understand the process and some of the thinking that goes behind how the county is issuing different orders. Unfortunately, we did have the call Friday morning, and by Friday evening, things obviously changed because of the state. So that's another, point of frustration, as we've all heard, that there needs to be a lot more coordination across different agencies. So that's been definitely, a struggle from the beginning, but will continue to be a challenge. And then, the other thing that we've been working on is clear signage and messaging. So as Barb mentioned, they've been printing signage to make it easier for businesses to have sort of coordinated and clean messaging. But I think the other thing that we pointed out is a need is for the general public to understand what the requirements are when they go outside. Part of what's really difficult for our small businesses is that we're having to be the ones educating the general public on the requirements. So there needs to be a larger messaging effort that goes out to the general public to understand how to keep themselves and our community safe. The other update is that we're still working on PPE sourcing and looking into how we can actually source PPE at, in bulk rates and distribute them possibly for free to help small businesses. And the conversation we're having now is whether it's best suited for the city to be the holder of that program, or if it's maybe some other party who does the management of that, just given the city's requirements around sourcing. And so the gaps that we have right now and sort of the needs are that we need to figure out how to have a centralized PPE hub because some businesses aren't able to get the supplies that they need. One small example is like hand wipes, like some places are sold out. So everyone's sort of scrambling to find supplies individually, but we can save some of the time and the effort and money if we can sort of coordinate. And then the other thing that was a gap is needing to promote the Flex Street initiative. Of course, now that things have sort of changed with the state and the county, we have a little bit more time, but in general, we needed to make sure that the Flex Streets initiative is getting out to folks who typically don't get as much access. And then the other gap is, of course, like clarifying the process with Alameda County, because we do need finer grain answers to some of the questions that we have, very tactical things like, is it okay to have a shared water station if we're trying to avoid having our wait staff, make more contact with customers? And one thing that we did hear from the county is that there just literally aren't that many industrial hygienists in the world. And so that's definitely a challenge. Yeah. Anyone from group one or two have anything to add that I missed?
This is Josh Simon. I'll just add very quickly that we're also meeting to look at how to fill vacant spaces and flexibility for that. So that meeting will be coming up. Just preview of coming attractions. I'll be glad to talk about offline if anybody wants to talk about that.
Thanks, Josh.
This is Leah with OSA. I had a question for Marissa, but we can go back to the monies that she mentioned getting and like the CARES grants. Like how are we going to find out if we want to apply for, if the businesses want to apply for any of those funds? Did I miss what she said about that?
You
Did you
didn't
want to
miss
answer
it.
that now, Marissa, or did you want to come back to it?
Just to quickly say, you didn't miss it. We haven't issued an application yet for CARES Act funds. I think, and Kelly and Alexa, feel free to chime in. We hope to have that available as soon as we can get it out.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Ari and her presentation for her working group?
I had a question. Hi, everybody. I've been gone for a couple of weeks because I had my baby girl. So,
congrats.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. We have a healthy baby girl. She's home. So my wife and child are here safe. And So it's been a couple weeks. So pardon me if my questions have been answered. This is my first meeting attending since the birth of my child. So with that said, Ari, do we have anything for group 2 for not just access to PPE and who's producing and distribution of PPE locally, but potentially funding for people who produce PPE locally? For instance, ourselves, like, we just distributed 2,000 face shields and face masks to San Quentin prison, right? So, that was a huge issue, and they didn't have PPE. And so between us and the It Takes a Village program, we're able to get nearly 2,000 units of PPE for face masks and face shields. Nobody funded that, right? We just did it. I'm sitting on a stockpile of PPE. I can make a face shield for every person in Oakland, right? But we need access to funding, be able to do this. I need to pay people, and there are other organizations I know locally that could be producing PPE. We could be producing PPE locally here in Oakland and distributing it to everyone in Oakland, right? Is there anything since I've been gone about any access to funding to produce PPE and distribute PPE locally here in Oakland?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our conversation, that was one of the questions that came up is like, how do we fund all of these things? I mean, whether it's PPE or public space, otherwise we know we're just replicating the same inequities of who has access and who doesn't. So we did have a little bit of conversation about, is it possible for the CARES Act to go towards that since it's a direct use? But to Marissa's point, like the economic development is still working with the city attorney to figure out how that money can be spent. So we still are kind of in a holding pattern right now.
Okay, so hurry up and wait, as we used to say. Okay, all right, that answers my question.
Atticus, you should tell us how we need to pull it together and get it moving.
All right, I will. So, so I mean, I'm just going to make this comment because one of the things we were talking about. So, the way I see it is we got two things, right? I mean, we have an increase of COVID-19 cases for a multitude of reasons in Oakland, and we're going to have a lashback of lockdowns, whether we like it or not, regardless of how we feel about it, right? So, us as a group and a community here have to do something about it, and we have to do something about it now, all right? So one thing that we know for a fact that helps flatten the curve, aside from locking people in their homes, is just having access to being able to wash your hands, right? Right, so you can lower the contact point, right, and spread the virus, and then, minimizing the aerosol and spray of the virus, which is face masks and face shields, right? Face masks, face shields, and hand cleaning go a huge way, right? And I think, it takes a village to raise a child. So things like having standardized signage, like I live in Jack London Square, right? And we did a social distancing of our baby on the lawn, right? By the estuary, right? And it was great and it was fantastic and all. But when I look around, I see so many people not abiding by social distancing rule, and there's nothing to remind people. And people who are advocates and want to express to people, hey, maybe we should be social distancing. It'd be great if we had some standardized public signage, right, along things like Jack London Square. We have people congregating on the grass and throughout. It makes it easier if we have some signage, and also makes it easier if we have access to PPE, right? Sometimes, like myself, who got to get ready a wife, a child, a dog, and get down to take a walk, and suddenly I realize, oh shit, I forgot my mask, right? And then I got to go around, I got to go back, I got to figure out where to put my mask, or I just got to go out without the mask, right? So I guess my urgency, I urge us now to take some efforts as a group to get PPE in people's hands, to have proper signage in place, right, publicly, right, to enforce the need for us to wear PPE, right, so we can help flatten this curve. And I mean, that's a pretty low-hanging fruit, a mask, a face shield, clean, sterilize your hands, right? And there's all kinds of ways. I mean, there are chemical companies here making hand sanitizers. I know, I have their pricing lists, right, for 55-gallon barrels of it, right? And they're local. They're here in Oakland, or in Emeryville, right? So can we get distribution of this? Can we get ahead of this? As a group, right, and help fight to flatten the curve together, and whether that's the city's providing funds, whether that's private companies provide, how can we pitch in as a group to just tackle this, right, and get on this? I mean,
I think that's the real question,
right?
Atticus, for me. And I know, Jose, you're going to make us shut up so you can get to the next presentation. But I think the question is, like, this is a brain trust right now. There's like 45 people. This is very expensive meeting. There's a lot of talent here, and we're talking, not doing. And so I'm curious, if we step away from the way that we're conditioned to think as bureaucrats, what do you all from the artistic, activist, private sector do when you need to deploy quickly? Because something on our side is not allowing that wisdom to activate. We are like in the 18th week of this damn pandemic and sitting on resources that are not deployed. And it is at this point damn near criminal for me. I'm listening to District 3 businesses crying on this line that I fought to get on this line so that you all could hear directly from them so that we could move quickly. And you have had an entire human being born in the time that we've been on this line. And that is, so, I mean, at some point, I hope we're wrapping up with, we're about to break the mode and recalibrate what we're doing. So we fought for those resources in the budget that staff just talked about, like elbowing and all of that stuff. But I'd be damned if we go another 14 weeks before it gets into people's pockets to keep them from drowning. Yeah. So y'all need to help us. And I'm Lynette is saying, no city hat, no city tree. Tell us how the hell to get this money out and what artists can do the kind of active generational thing, Atticus, that you're talking about right now, because that's like super hot. But I don't know how to do it. But somebody on this line should be a general and say, this is what needs to happen. And here's our 48 hours, 72 hour, 160 hours. Let's go. Like, for reals. All right, I'm done. Jose, I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate it. And that's exactly what we need. I think we know the problem. We know the numbers. Now we need that exact same passion to get things. And I appreciate Atticus raising the point around PPE and how we can actually look at locally to support that effort and do this all together. So I appreciate that. So we're going to move on to the phase 3 and cross sector. We combine those two. I know Julina is leading that effort with Micah, but Micah unfortunately is not able to be here. He's taking some well-needed time off. But Jelena, if you're okay with it, I was going to start really quick talking about the rent relief really quick. Is that okay?
That sounds great.
Thanks, Jelena. So Jelena and I are, I was leading the effort on phase 3. And just really quickly on the update, we had a really good call a couple of weeks ago with business owners. Michael Bush is taking doing a big lift on this effort to bring rent relief to business owners through figuring out whether there's a way to negotiate with landlords and property owners rent relief and rent forgiveness. We heard loud and clear from the business owners around the common principles around needing forgiveness, deferral, and lease extension. But first and foremost, we also need the eviction protection policy first to be extended. I think that's something that the business owners really advocated for in order for them to really be able to have a chance to survive and continue being a small business in Oakland. They first need to know, and the city government, state government, federal government to really understand that they really need that eviction protection to give them time for that negotiation. So we're developing a proposal around, everything from triggers around percentage of sales beyond just saying, we need you to forgive March through the end of the year for the property owners, which was a drastic proposal. We want to really draw up scenarios, and Michael Bush is doing that. And then now the next step is this week, we're having 2 separate meetings with landlords. Everything from the CIMs, TMGs, signatures, to also then include the small property owners as well. And Dr. Tran, I don't know if she's on the call, but she reminded us that it's also important to reach out to the smaller landlords, especially in Chinatown. They may have the language barrier to really hear what we're trying to do with this group. So we are committing to that, to making sure that we hold a couple meetings, including those smaller property owners that may have a language barrier, so we can also hear from them, and so they can hear from us where we see if the city of Oakland is going to continue saving businesses, there has to be pretty drastic measures, and also the urgency of making sure that we all understand each other's point of view from the business side. I think forgiveness and deferral of rent is something that's what we heard loud and clear that everybody wants to pursue. So I think by the next one, even if I don't want to wait till the next full council, but I will send some notes to the full group around the conversation that we had, Michael Bush and I know the city of Oakland is going to be participating in that. The county of Alameda is going to be participating in that. Just the summary notes of our conversation with the property owners. So more to come on that, but I just wanted to mention that that's a huge priority from our end.
Hey, Jose, this is Kat. May I make 2 suggestions responsive to your comments and Lynette's?
Sure.
On the rent forgiveness, just remember that the smaller community banks it will have an effect on the classification of their assets if the smaller landlords who are financed by them are not able to pay their normal debt payments. So you might want the DBO or one of the regulatory agencies that governs the banks, that regulates the banks, some input from them. And then with regard to funds that are raised for disaster relief and then never released, that was true in the North Bay fire. Some hosting organizations were bigger after the fire than they were before, which is not what we want. So the governor and California for All advertise or promotes the disaster relief funds, and they perhaps they could run an accountability monitoring of it as well, because we're quick to give the tax deduction and slow to get the impact. So if they rated the disaster relief funds in terms of their getting the money out, at least there would be a cultural narrative that made it unacceptable to stockpile the money, get the tax deduction, but not actually provide the relief.
Thanks for that, Kat. That's actually really helpful. So appreciate your comments.
Sure thing.
Jelena?
Yes, no, thank you. I'll move on the next, please. And also, I think just to tag team with Jose on the rent relief, know that the Port of Oakland is also currently adopting its rental deferment program for some of its tenants throughout the airport and the seaport. So I can provide at our next meeting very specific examples of that. In addition, I also want to talk about, I think, listening to all that was spoken to earlier today, and especially with the call for this mind trust that we have in place here. I think there's a lot of knowledge about how to get those funding out as quickly as possible, as we heard from Lynette McElhaney. And so I wanted to call on a few folks to talk, but basically the secondary part of our conversations on the cross sector was about equity, not debt, meaning how do we get the dollars out to our Black-owned businesses that are hurting now? How do we resuscitate those who we've already lost and bring them back? And I think that's really going to be critical. We also discussed 3 other areas, which is leveraging large corporations on how to work together for reshaping and funding Black-owned businesses and small businesses throughout this experience. Looking at the new city regulatory framework, how do we ease licensing, insurance requirements, and that this just goes not just to the flex streets city program, but beyond, and how do we sustain this? And then, of course, the potential impact, economic impact on these recommendations, and how do we move them forward quickly? And I think we have folks on the line now. I'm going to call out a few people. We have Debbie from Greenlining, and Michael, who were both on those calls, and of course CJ. And in order to get some of this immediacy done, let's see if I can call on Debbie from Greenlining, if she would like to share just a little bit on how we activate the distribution of these funds that we're talking about to have immediate impact on these businesses.
Yeah, thanks, Julina. Well, I know that we have been working directly with Marissa and City Hall on how to, be more direct and provide the wraparound services that go along with the funds, because actually we're trying to identify the need and how to best facilitate. So it's still very much a work in process. I don't think it has the immediacy that we're talking about right here, but maybe Marissa can, now we're tag teaming, the tag team could jump in of how we can get the city funds activated. We have actually been also talking of some of the private funds.
I think, Deborah, you're talking about the POC Small Business Network, which we have been working on, which would have some grant funding for both legacy businesses and new entrepreneurs. Is that what you're thinking? And we talked about, we are planning that for a launch in August, September. But that is, I think, one of many programs. And I think, Julina, you're also asking us about what additional fund, that is one program that we could use maybe to help legacy businesses stay and a few entrepreneurs rebuild their business if it was forced to close down. So I think we're either thinking about, scaling something like that, or other ways in which we can turn funding around quickly to get to the businesses that need it.
Yes, Marissa, I would say yes on both levels.
Mm-hmm.
Immediacy is obviously urgent to get this out, regardless of what the funding source is. But really, I think to Councilmember McElhaney's point is, how do we eliminate that, those bureaucracies? How do we get a fluid system in place? We heard earlier references to a hub resource for PPE. We need a hub resource for the financing and economic impact, right? To walk these businesses back to life, because this wasn't, we wanted to be careful about scaling and really talk about the immediate need of those who we've potentially already lost, and how do we bring them back? And so I think that was a critical point of the discussion that we had in the cross-sector group. The other piece that we wanted to highlight also was the immediacy on the impact for those workers, right? So we talk a lot about how we're going to resuscitate and bring back our businesses, but also about for those workers, knowing that the World Kitchen program is likely going to end. We need to think about what is the distribution and needs for workers and for families. As the food distribution out of World Kitchen comes to an end. We also need to think about the unemployment insurance, which has been extended through July 31st. That's also coming to an end. And these are going to have huge impacts on people's needs to be able to get out and do what they need to do in order to put food on their families' tables. So, there was just obviously a sense of urgency, and that urgency just keeps rising to new levels every week with the rise and the increase of COVID-19. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Julina. And I can quickly say, because we're funding the majority of the World Central Kitchen work, that there's sufficient funding to keep that program going through the end of this calendar year, for sure. It was originally going to end by the end of August, but now it's going to continue likely through the end of December 2020.
That's great news.
Any other questions for any groups? So I know we're getting behind, so maybe I'll turn it back to you, Alexa, so you can introduce Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. And I see that Mark Everton has his hand up. So quickly, Mark, do you want to make a comment or ask a question quickly before we hand it over to
very
Michael?
quickly, to follow up on what Julina had said, the San Francisco recently passed a healthy buildings ordinance, which was put forth by Unite Here Local 2 to bring back maybe 100 workers into hotels to clean them. But the cost of the hotels is literally tens of millions of dollars. And some of the hotels in San Francisco have decided to delay opening from August to January, simply because the healthy buildings ordinance is so onerous. So I would just recommend that while we're looking at how we help our workers and we get workers back to work, that we do it in a balanced approach and we make sure that we're not benefiting a handful and in turn keeping scores of them from being able to get back and gainfully employed.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Michael now, who's going to help us with the framing around how to frame our equitable recovery. So Michael?
Yeah, Alexa, do you still, want to just check to make sure, do you still think it's needed? Because I've heard so many good recommendations on how to proceed. So I just wanted to make sure I calibrated that with you before we jumped in.
I mean, I think that I'll defer to you, but I think that it would be helpful maybe as we think about sort of how the city is starting to align all these recommendations and really focus on tying them to specific equitable outcomes. I think it would be helpful just to frame that up in the time we have remaining. We have about 15 minutes. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I'll do it quickly because it's this frame and the document can be put in the chat so that you can all have the work behind it. But it was really a frame that we developed in the early days of the pandemic to really begin to try to have a conversation around accountability in places that we went to. To me, this is the most important thing, the accountability for the dollars and who's going to be saved and who's not. And so I've heard a lot of that on this call today, and I think that is probably one of the most powerful places for us to begin to do additional work, which is to figure out, like, for example, around getting the money out. What is the accountability mechanism for making sure that, one, it gets out, that the barriers are removed, and that it is actually having the impact that it wants, and specifically in targeting the people that you want it to target. And so there's I'll just go quickly through a couple of these principles and then leave time for Q&A. You know, the thing that we wanted to center in this, when it talks about racial equity, it's talking about really all the folks who have been left behind, quite frankly. In many cases, we talk about centering Black folks and anti-Black racism, because in many cases, the design of these systems that have been allowed to endure start from that original sin of this Black-white paradigm in this nation, and it hasn't been resolved. And because it hasn't been resolved, a host of other folks get caught up in it as well. But the bottom line is, if we're talking about centering racial equity, we are talking about centering the future of the nation, which is Black and brown folks. But in doing that, we're also holding the thing, I think, which is the most important piece in the definition around equity, which is all. It's not about excluding, but it is about making sure that we're focusing on the most vulnerable and allowing that to have cascading benefit to everyone else. So this is that one thing that in many cities people shy away from. I don't see that so much here. But if you really want to get to being accountable, you have to do this work. I mean, you see a perfect example where when you don't do it, what happens? 2 big policy failures recently. Millions, if not trillions of dollars wasted because they missed the mark. One was PPP, the other is opportunity zones. If you ask the standard of the questions, are they working for the folks who need it to work most? No. You can find some good in these programs. It's pretty expensive good to find. And so centering racial equity is the work of our generation, to get beyond acting like we're afraid to talk about the needs of Black and brown people and why we should be doing that work. And so as we think about recovery, we should be thinking about, do the strategies that we're implementing actually really get us to making sure that Black and brown business owners are actually being made whole, being brought back, restored. That should be the standard that we should be trying to hold ourselves to. When we talk about putting people first, we talk about putting people first because we have this fetish with putting business first in this nation. It is the hierarchy of human value that we talk about. While corporations aren't human, we tried to make the legal case that they are, and they get preferential treatment. But at the bottom, at the end of the day, the 100 million in America, more than 100 million in America who are economically insecure, keep having to fight for crumbs, if they can even get those. And you see that even happening in the state of California, where folks are still waiting to get their unemployment stuff that they paid into. That's just unacceptable. But even more important, when you think about all the recovery packages that have been gone out, we're actually in a debate right now in this nation whether people who are in this country deserve $600. Think about how pathetic that is. When we have all this evidence around the country that if you actually care for your folks, some really powerful things can happen that are transformative. And yet, because of that black-white paradigm in this country, that welfare queen frame that runs in the background as an operating system, we can't put people first if it means that black and brown folks will get a dime. And it's hurting everyone. And that's why when you read the book Dying of Whiteness, you see this black-white paradigm is actually killing white folks in some cases at a faster rate than it is black folks now. And so putting people first, the 100 million, those most in need, has to be the accountability standard. And then you can do whatever you want to do after that. When we talk about investing in community infrastructure, you see the city doing some of this. We're actually talking about paying attention to those nonprofits who have been in community, who have the trust, who know how to move quickly, who can get money into the hands of folks who need it today. They shouldn't be looked over, skipped over. So the larger institutions who may use the language but don't know the practice or the people are financed and well capitalized. It's a way, again, to center what we respect in community. Some of the infrastructure work that the city is doing around access to broadband, to Wi-Fi. Another example of investing in community infrastructure that is fundamental for folks if they're going to be able to be liberated from some of the oppressive ways in which this economy holds us back. And then at the crux of a lot of what we're talking about is to actually have an economy that is not extractive, that actually allows people to actually not have to work 2 jobs just to survive. Even in the Bay, even if you're working 2 jobs, there may be out of 1,500 neighborhoods, only about 5% of them that you can afford to live in. That's not sustainable. And so as we think about this work, it is about what you heard the council member and others talk about. How do we really reimagine what our economy needs to be so that it works for folks? And right now, that reimagining the economy does start with, how do we help businesses get through this moment? How do we help them think about debt, whether it's forgiven or some other creative way to deal with it? But these are real issues that have everything to do with how we think about our economy. And then lastly, while this is not so much an issue here, it is around the country, that if we really want to have ultimate accountability, the most elegant expression of accountability in this democracy has to stop being thwarted. People have to be able to vote. They just have to be able to vote, and they have to be able to vote and not stand in line for 6 hours. Our grandmothers, our grandfathers shouldn't have to stand in line for hours just to exercise a right that they've already fought and died for. And so when we think about these principles, was the intention, to begin to join in a way that would allow us to begin to frame some of the national policy debates and some of the local ones that we are involved in, so that we could actually walk away and answer one fundamental question. Is that 100 million actually better off because of all the trillions of dollars that are waffling around in this market? And the answer right now is tragically no, we're missing the mark. And so in these conversations, I think the more we can bring a lens to who are the people that we're talking about specifically, and how do we begin to help them based on their unique needs now, that's the intention of this process. So that PolicyLink can be held accountable as it begins to do its work and not just produce paper. So nobody's going to be housed by our paper, our speeches, et cetera, are going to have their businesses saved, but to use it as a way to begin to push the electeds to be accountable, push philanthropy, push corporate leaders to actually meet the demands of people of color today. So I'll stop there. And lastly, these are just some of the resources that are currently available. The National Equity Atlas is one of the tools that we're beginning to use to have this conversation around in cities. are folks better off, this 100 million that I'm talking about. And so in some ways, a new role for us to play is more assertively holding electeds accountable for what's going well as what's not going well. And then just a host of other framing documents. You know, one that is new that is really important is this advancing frontline employees of color. As corporations come to this work, if they really wanted to know what they could do right now within their corporations to advance worker power and mobility, it lays out more than 21 evidence-based policies that they could do today. So in many cases, these tools are really, the research doesn't have to happen. It's been done by PolicyLink, Greenlining, and so many other organizations in Oakland and around the country. The question is, do we have the heart and the commitment to actually do the work that is necessary to really step into this transformative moment and actually meet that intensity and heat that's in the street, bring that into our organizations and actually create something that's even more powerful and sustainable.
Thank you so much, Michael.
No problem.
Michael,
Yeah.
this is Lynette. Happy Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. A real quick question. The second resource here where you're talking about frontline employees, what is that one speaking to?
It's really speaking to 22 million frontline workers, all those folks we call heroes today that bag our groceries, clean our buildings at night.
Okay.
It's 22 million of them, 9 million of people of color. And this is usually often in many cases where a lot of people of color enter into the workforce. So this was a way for us beginning to help corporations as they come to this work say, look, this is stuff you could actually put in play today that would increase their wages and help them move up the ladder in these organizations. So it's that work that we're trying to do, one, to get into the corporate space, to begin to change the cultures so that Black and brown folks can actually be successful in these organizations and actually move up in them.
Okay, I appreciate that because I was trying to figure out where that is. And then in the conversations that you're in, are we beginning to hear anything, two things that come to mind in terms of this higher level of accountability, which is dialing back the sort of Bush era tax cuts that left us in the place now where we're not really fully funding HUD or some of the other, you know, in this conversation of defunding police or defunding the military and putting it into more of our human services? Are we beginning to hear that government has been starved of our ability to do the safety network that was previously done in the 70s? And then has this in any way advanced the discussion around Medicare for all or expanding medical access, given how many more people are going to be without medical coverage now that so many people are unemployed and that employer-based coverage isn't working to deal with the 22 million frontline workers who are at a higher level of exposure to the virus?
Yeah, well, there are folks on this call who I know are working on the Biden campaign, but this is the fight to have. What will we center in the next administration? I mean, there's so much work that has to be done, but will we center the 100 million? That's why I keep bringing that up. We center everybody else. We hear all the accolades and the platforms, and the question now is, will you fight for this stuff? Not in your last year, but in your first year. In your first 100 days, will you fight for this agenda? This is the fight that advocates have to wage right now. This is the fight that PolicyLink is going to be in, because quite frankly, the results that we want to see in this nation, they're actually held hostage to its structure. Until we do some of the things that you just said, we can't deliver on the results that we want. And the reason why we keep running into problems is because the policy agenda, even though it's behind it, it keeps getting racialized, and it's checkmate. And so this is the fight that we've got to have. The beauty is we have a moment with the movement for Black Lives and others being in the streets and giving us something to actually stand on and wage this fight. But this is the battle. We cannot let a platform come forward that is not transformative and worthy of the moment.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So moving on, we have just a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to, before we closed, Marissa was going to walk us through some of the next steps for the council, because we wanted to be very clear, I think, to Councilwoman McElhaney's points and others about how this is all getting distilled and how it's moving forward. So Marissa, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Michael McAfee and everyone for your comments. So the working group is doing two things. You're giving us immediate needs and recommendations that we can follow up on right away. And I heard two of those very clearly today around PPE and social distancing protocols, as well as getting funding out the door as fast as possible. We're also taking the recommendations that are more long-term in putting them into a report to our mayor and vice mayor. So at your next meeting on August 17th, a little over a month from now, we'd like to present an interim, we'll invite the mayor and vice mayor to join us, and we'd like to be presenting our recommendations. Staff will be working with the working group leads in our new working group structure, where we have merged groups around PPE and support for small businesses, Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned businesses, and our phase 4 working group. We'll be working with the leads to develop those recommendations, to put data behind them, and our real concrete asks, and presenting that on August 17th as a draft or interim report. But we'll be, doing the follow-up in addition between them. We aren't just working on delivering a paper. I also wanted to say that we did introduce the idea of a recommendation template. As much as possible, when ideas come up during these meetings, I'm trying to follow up individually with the advisor that brings them up. But if you feel like, I did create a recommendation template in case you wanted to use that model instead of just working through the working groups to make recommendations. I heard helpful feedback from the leads that was maybe too cumbersome and difficult to work with. But I do want to offer that if you have had something kind of burning in your mind, like why isn't the advisory council moving this forward, or wouldn't this help all of us to achieve our equity goals? Please just feel free to email me directly, and so that I can be very assured that I'm not missing any of your great insights and thoughts. So those are our next steps before next month. And I'm not the close, Alexa. Are you the closing comments, or do I get to bid everyone thank you and goodbye?
We can do it either way, Marissa. We are at time. I do want to thank everyone and bid you goodbye. And I know there were a lot of questions and discussion around the CARES funding. As Councilmember McElhaney pointed out, it is staff's top priority to allocate the portion of that funding that was directed to us in council. So that was actually adopted in the mid-cycle budget just at the end of last month. And we are working quickly with the finance team in the budget office to understand how quickly the funds can be received by the city and pushed out and allocated. And to Councilmember McElhaney's point, which is very well taken, we are visioning as much as we can to work around the bureaucratic process, including working with the city attorney to find ways to push funds out directly. So council members, I know Councilmember Taylor's on the line too, to the extent that you can support us and staff in carrying that message at council and to the city attorney to streamline those processes as much as possible, working under the emergency order and moving quickly to push those funds out. So that is going to be
get the application together, together, put the applications up, let people start applying even before we have the money. We shouldn't be waiting for that to figure out how people can apply. We need to know what people need so that when we get the rest of it. So hopefully, I want to give you an inspirational stretch goal that we will have a draft of the single application for support like by Friday. Woo! Let's go team!
Stretch goals. All right. So yeah, everybody stay tuned. That is our top priority moving forward. So I just want to thank this group for the recommendations. Thank you all. Thank you to our amazing co-chairs and our working group leads. I know this is a lot of work. Keep the input and the questions coming, and we will be speaking to you sooner than our next meeting next month. And feel free to reach out anytime with any questions or comments or ideas. So thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the good news, Atticus. That was the best part of the day. We got a baby. Woo!
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you all. Thank you.
Congratulations, Atticus.
Blessings.